Hi, everyone. Thank you all for coming. How are you guys doing today? Having a good time? All right. How'd you like the keynote and some of the stuff that we announced today? It's exciting, right? Well, thank you guys all for coming to my session today. This is the Advanced Parse track. And today we'll be talking about building line of business apps with Parse. How many of you guys are familiar with the term line of business apps? Okay, not too many. So just to give you a little bit of context, a line of business app is usually an app that's created in the context of getting work done as opposed to being kind of the product itself. So this is an HR app for your company, for example, or something for tracking your customers or things like that. Those are often your line of business applications. Everything here that you're going to see here applies to any Parse app that you want to build. These are, we're just going to go over some of the things that Parse offers that are particularly relevant to these types of applications. So we'll take a look at some features that are relevant for line of business applications, as I just mentioned. Some of the things that you're going to see might surprise you because Parse is often just looked at as a consumer app tool, but it really is relevant no matter what you're doing and no matter what kind of app you're building. So as I mentioned, a lot of people will look at Parse and say, wait, why would I use Parse for line of business apps? And the reality is, Parse is actually great for building apps like this because it gets you up and running extremely quickly. You can really go from zero to app without a lot of friction, and we provide a bunch of features that get you running quickly. Things like user authentication, so we take care of actually pulling in username and passwords correctly, not actually storing passwords, doing all of the authentication itself, and then handling things like password resets and email verifications correctly. We also provide a set of rich data access controls that allows you to actually protect access to the data that you've stored with Parse. So you can restrict which users can see the data, which users can modify it, things like that. In addition to just having data access controls, we allow you to specify permission groups using Parse roles. We give you some tools for doing data validation so that you can make sure that the data that you've actually stored on Parse is high integrity data, where you actually know that the data meets the schema that you happen to be defining, things like that. And we also have some pre-built UI that gets you up off the ground really, really quickly. So when you are building an app using Parse, you can just take a query and show some UI for it, and now you can immediately see the data that you've stored to Parse in your app, even as you're building, and without necessarily having spent a lot of time building out a rich UI. In addition to all of that, if you have existing infrastructure that you've been using for your line of business app or for your app in general, you can integrate with that infrastructure using Cloud Code. So you can very easily make HTTP requests to whatever existing servers that you have in order to pull that data into your Parse app. And finally, we go wherever you go. So whatever tools you're using to build your applications and to get up and running quickly, we want to be there for you. And you probably saw this slide earlier today when Ilya was talking. Parse has SDKs for pretty much any platform you can think of, whether you're building an iOS app, an Android app, you're building for Windows, whether it's the Metro environment or the desktop environment, building for OS X. We even have a Xamarin SDK, so if you're using a cross-platform tool like Xamarin to actually build and share code across platforms, you can continue to use Parse. And of course, we have a JavaScript SDK, which lets you build out your web apps, and also now server-side apps using, whether you're using Node.js or you're building using Parse hosting, you can use Parse as your backend. So let's talk a little bit about some of the things that get you up and running with your app extremely quickly. One of the big things is our prefabricated UI components. So on iOS, we provide login and sign-up view controllers, which take care of all of the login for you. You can very easily pull this into your app and not have to worry about building the same piece of UI with every app that you build, where you need a text box for the name and a password box for the password. And you need to handle the case where the user hasn't signed up yet, things like that. We take care of all of that for you. Similarly, we have PF Query Table View Controller, which makes it really, really easy to present a list of all of the parse objects, or PF objects if you're working with our iOS SDK, without really having to do any work to actually display that stuff. On Android, we have Parse Query Adapter, which is very similar to PF Query Table View Controller in that it's an Android adapter that will actually pull data from Parse using a query. And you can use this with any of the UI controls that are built into Android that support adapter view. So list view is one of the most common ones, but things like spinners and combo boxes will all just work directly with your parse data. And then across all of the platforms, we've tried to make it really, really easy to make responsive UI based on the parse objects that are backing that UI. So on Windows, for example, or in the .NET framework, we implement iNotify property change to raise change notifications. In JavaScript, we use Backbone as a mechanism for raising our change notifications. And on iOS and Android, again, we try and make it as simple as possible to actually integrate parse objects with your UI. So let's take a quick look at ways that you can go and integrate these things into your app. So if we can switch over to my laptop, that would be great. Thank you very much. So here I've got a quick parse app that's already set up. This is a employee or HR headcount tracking app. Very simple, has a bunch of employees in it. Right now I've only got one user. That's me, David. And we're going to go ahead and start building this app pretty much from scratch in Xcode. So the first thing that I'm going to want to do is allow people to log into my app. So what I'm going to do is pull up, this happens to be based on our starter project. Really the only thing I've done is set up the keys for my application. And I'll go into my main view controller. And when it appears, I'm going to check to see if I already have a user logged in. And if not, I'll show our PF login view controller. So I'll say if not, PF user, current user. So if I don't already have a current user, then let's create a login view controller. So PF login view controller, LVC equals login view controller alloc init. I'm going to need to handle some callbacks from this to dismiss it appropriately after a user logs in, things like that. I've already set up the delegate for it, but it's really just one line of code in each of the callbacks. So I'll say lvc.delegate equals self. And finally, I actually need to show the login view controller. And that's as simple as saying self present modal view controller LVC, and we'll go ahead and animate that in. Now, if I build and run, what you'll see is I immediately get a login UI. Now, all of this UI is completely customizable. You can go and change the look. It doesn't have to say parse, all of those things. You can actually determine which buttons you want to appear here. It already is set up for social integration, so if you happen to be using Facebook or Twitter login, probably not in your line of business app, but in general, if you happen to be using Facebook or Twitter login, you can show those buttons here as well. So I can go ahead and log into my app really, really easily. I'll just say David, and my password is pass here, so none of you can steal it. And what you'll see, and I've just printed this out using nslog, is that I've logged in the user. And that's really all it takes to get login working within my application. Now, if you took a look at that dialog that showed up, there's also a sign up button. So if I click that button, what you'll see is our sign up view controller. And again, I can go and customize these things as I want, but this should already just work. I can just say my username is PDD and my password is pass again. And if I say sign up, this is actually going out and hitting parse and logging in. Now, I haven't set up the delegate, so it doesn't dismiss the window at the moment, but it's just one more line of code to go and set that up. And if I go back and look at the data browser on parse.com, you'll see very quickly that I now have my new user already set up. So it just took like 3 minutes to get set up using PF login view controller and PF signup view controller with login for my application. Let's now take a look at an Android version of this app. So I'm going to switch over to Xcode. and take a look at displaying a query. So here, I've got my list of employees, which we saw in the data browser. And if I want to display these in my app, I need to actually have a list view set up in my app. So I'll go back to to Eclipse and pull up my main layout. And I've already dropped in a simple list view here, no other configuration on that list view. And when I go back to the activity that's actually displaying it, I need to go and fetch that list view and assign an adapter that's a parse query adapter so that it will actually pull down data from Parse using a parse query. So let's go ahead and get that list view. List equals list view, and it is find view by ID, r.id.listview1. Okay, so this is just going to go and fetch that list view that was rendered on the screen. Now I need to create an adapter for it. So we'll say adapter equals new parse query adapter. And it's a parse query adapter of parse object. So of parse object. So if I were using parse users or some custom subclass, all of this would be strongly typed for me. We'll pass in the context, which is this. And we need to decide which class we're actually going to display. In this case, it was the employee class. So I've created my parse query adapter. Now I actually need to go ahead and assign that to my list view. So I'll say list.setAdapter to my adapter. So that's all it's going to take to actually pull that parse data into my app. So I'm going to go ahead and build and run. And with a little luck, the Android emulator will cooperate. All right, so I have a bunch of gobbledygook in my application. What you're seeing there are actually the object IDs of every parse object in this query. That's because the default view, just so that you know what's going on, is the object ID of the objects that have been pulled down. Actually changing the view to show, for example, the name of each employee is as simple as a setting on our adapter. So let's go back to Eclipse and say adapter.setTextKey to be name. So what I expect this to do is actually show me the name of every user as it gets pulled down. So I'll go ahead and run that again. This will just take a moment. Now, all of the views that you're seeing here are actually customizable. So you can go ahead and actually swap out the views with something much more complex than a simple string or a string and an image. Here we go. But in the cases where all you need to do is display some text from your parse object, it's as simple as just setting the text key there. So now you can see the list of names for all of my employees showing up really easily within my application. Now, Parse Adapter actually takes care of a whole bunch of things that you often have to deal with when you're working with data over the network. For example, when you need to paginate data so that you're not pulling down a list of 1,000 employees all at once, Parse Query Adapter will take care of that for you very, very easily. So again, all I have to do here is say adapter.setObjectsPerPage. And just for the purposes of this demo, let's make it 15. And when I build and run, what you'll see is that Parse Query Adapter actually takes care of keeping track of what page has been downloaded, presenting a load more objects button, and actually interacting with the user as they actually pull up that data. So I've got my set of users here. At the bottom, I've reached the end of my 15 items that are being displayed. I can click the Load More button, and the Parse Query Adapter will automatically go on and pull down the rest of the data. So that's how quick it is to actually get up and running with your UI for your applications. Let's switch back to the presentation. So now that we've got some ways to look at the data that we've already stored with Parse, one of the things that we're going to want to take care of is making sure that the data that's on Parse is correct and appropriate, that the clients, which we obviously can't trust because they are clients, we don't own the code, we don't own the machines that are going to be running them, that data is actually appropriate for my service. So this is where Cloud Code comes in and kind of rescues you for everything that you want to build here. Before save, which is one of our triggers, so that happens every time an object is being saved, is your hook for validation within your applications. In addition to the validation stuff, before save can be used to actually sanitize data or compute other fields, anything that you need to do in order to make sure that you've got correct data in your database. So let's switch back to the laptop here, and we'll do a quick demo of sanitizing and validating. So looking at the data that we have on Parse for this application, there's a couple of things that I want to make sure are kind of invariants for the data for my company. One of them is the email addresses of all of the employees of the company should probably be my domain. So what I can do is write a little bit of cloud code in a before save handler that actually checks to see that the data coming in the email field is the right type. So right now, for example, I can go ahead and change Mike's email address to mike@fake.com. And that all just sort of works. I've now got bad data in my database. If I'm making assumptions about the data that's there, I'm sort of stuck. So let's change this back. Mike@mycompany.com. And let's actually add some validation. So we'll pull up our cloud code. There's not a whole lot here. I'm just setting up a before save. And you'll see I've got a regex set up that actually checks to see whether a string fits with my email address scheme that I'm looking for. In this case, it's alphanumeric plus underscores @mycompany.com. So let's actually add the validation check. So I'll say if I've got an email address at all, so if request.object.getEmail, that says there is an email address attached to this object, and when I test to see if the email address matches my regex, it fails. So I'll say and not email regex.test. And again, the email address, so request.object.getEmail. So if that test fails, I actually want to bail out of the save altogether. And that's why we're doing this in the before save. So I can say response.error. Invalid email address, and then return so that we don't continue doing any additional processing. I'll save that and deploy it up to my Parse app. And now if I go back to the data browser and I try and save Mike's email address as mike@fake.com, what you'll see down here at the bottom is the error that I've just surfaced from cloud code. So we make sure to actually plumb all of these errors back through to all of our client SDKs, which happens to be, the data browser here is just using our JavaScript SDK essentially to pull down this information. We actually plumb all of this information back through, and you can actually handle these errors, these custom errors, within your client code. Now let's take a look at sanitizing a little bit of data. So here I've got a set of phone numbers. I really want all of them to kind of fit my phone number format so that I can do some additional processing. I know I'm using kind of a non-standard format here, but you wouldn't expect for me to be able to just type a random string and save that into my database. What I want is for even a normal phone number, so 10 digits, to be converted to my new format. So let's go ahead and change this back. And let's go and add some sanitization code. So we'll go back to our before save. And I've already got a method written here that's sanitize phone number that just takes 10 digits in a string and turns them into that parenthesized phone number string that you have come to expect. So what I'm going to do here is actually sanitize the phone number. So we'll say sanitized equals sanitized phone number, and I'll pass in the phone number that I'm getting from the request object. So request.object.get, let me double check that I got the name right, phone. So now we've actually sanitized the phone number. Now we need to save it back into the object. So all we have to do here is say request.object.set phone to the sanitized number, and we should actually be good to go. So I'll go ahead and deploy this. And now, if I go to the data browser and I type in a phone number, let's say it's 111-111-1111, wonderful phone number. Oh, whoops. Just a moment. Demo, gotta love it. Let's try that one more time. So I'm going to, well, I'm not totally sure what I haven't done here, but that's all right. What you would see, if I had gotten this part of the demo correctly, sorry about that, is as soon as I enter that number, you're going to actually see the updated data show up in the data browser. So you'll actually see the parenthesized version of the phone number. And all of this works because when you go and change a value in your before save, we will actually send that value back to whatever client has made the request, and the data on the client will be updated as well. So if you're using our iOS SDK and you do a save like this, and then check the phone field afterward, you'll see the corrected phone number. Alrighty, let's go ahead and switch back to the presentation. All right, so we've talked a little bit about how to make sure that your data is high integrity on the server side. I had my little demo snafu, which is always a great one to have. Let's take a look at how you can actually protect access to your data when you're building an app with Parse. So we know that your data may be sensitive. Not every user should have access to all of the data stored in your Parse app. So let's look at ways that we can protect it. The core of all of this with Parse is the Parse user. Parse user is kind of a special object within Parse where we associate an access token with that user, and all of our client SDKs send that access token to Parse with every request that they make. Parse then takes that access token, figures out what user it belongs to, and then checks before returning the results of a query or taking some action whether that user has permission to do whatever you're trying to do. Parse roles actually give you a way to group your users and create permission groups, essentially. So for example, in my HR app, I can have a role for all of the people at my company who are members of the HR team that has a different set of permissions from all of the rest of my employees. Now, we give you control over access at various levels. So you can control access at the per object level using ACLs. We have ACL is an access control list. It allows you to define which users and roles can read or write each object. We also have class level permission lists that let you say, my employee class can only be updated by users in this role, but it can be, I can fetch the employees from users in this role. And then if there are any gaps in what we provide out of the box, you can use Cloud Code as your gate. So just like we saw that you could return an error in your response from your before save when the data was invalid, you could also check to see whether the current user has whatever privileges you want to define and error out in that case as well. And then what you can do is write, for example, a cloud function that goes and does some query using extra privileges, for example, using the master key, and this use master key is kind of your key to go in and bypass our ACL system in Cloud Code. So you can use the use master key method to actually pull down the data that you want, even though it's privileged, and return just the subset of it that you want to that user. So let's take a quick look back at the laptop here. And we're going to play just a little bit with ACLs. So I want to first show you one of my very favorite features of the data browser that I bet you many of you haven't seen, which is if you go ahead and open up the JavaScript console, and don't worry about the errors that are showing up there, that's just some, that's the indication of our validation responses. So if you go ahead and open up the JavaScript console, you can actually write JavaScript code using our JavaScript SDK right from Chrome. So if you want to just go play with objects, you can do it. Be careful, it's dangerous. You're actually working against your data, but you can do so. So I can set up ACLs really easily. I can create a new Parse ACL by saying var ACL equals new parse.ACL. And I can take that ACL and set a number of different fields on it. So I can set whether the public is allowed to read or write whatever object this ACL will be attached to. I can also say whether a particular user will be able to read or write this object. And I can also say which roles should be able to read or write the object. And then once I've done all of that, I can just say, I can just set the ACL field on any of my parse objects, and they will be applied. Now we're actually going to do that through the data browser itself, just because it's a little simpler to get going with. But let's go ahead and take our first user, Mike, who you saw there. And right now, it's set up to be readable and writable by every user. So if I want to turn off access for every user, I can just empty out this hash here and save the object. And now if I go back to my Android app and refresh, whoops, let's scroll up to the top, and refresh, what I should see, all right, I'm going to have demo problems today. No worries. What I would see, if I had done something right here, is that, that Mike no longer shows up in my queries. Similarly, I can go and restrict access just to my particular user by heading over to my user class, pulling the object ID of the user that I want to grant permissions to, and then I can go back and say, oh, you know what? I bet you my old cloud code is still causing problems. That's why. OK, hold on one moment. Let's go back and save this. So if I go back here and remove the ACLs, I should be now able to see that Mike disappears from the list of users that shows up in the query. Recovery! Phew. Alrighty. So now I can go and take that ACL and provide access just to my David user that I've already set up. So I've gone and copied that object ID from the user table. And I can give read permission to that user. And let's say the user is only readable by my David user. So I'll go ahead and save the object there. And you can see it successfully updated the object. And now, if I refresh, I get back Mike. Thanks. Similarly, I can take a role and provide role-based access to this object. So I can go to my roles class, and you can see I've created here an HR role. And if I look at the users that are in that role, it includes my David user. So if I want to set up access just for that role, instead of providing an object ID here, I can say role : and then the name of the role. And the reason we do this is so that you don't actually have to have access to the roles themselves to be part of those permission groups. So you don't need to be able to go and read or write the HR role itself to be inside of the permission group and to set up ACLs for that permission group. And again, if I go back to the app, I can query, and Mike will still be there. So that's per object level ACLs. The next place where I can set access controls is by going down to this More dropdown and setting permissions. So here you can see a variety of different permissions that I have control over, and I can provide access to users or different roles. So for example, if I were to take the find permission, I could modify who's able to actually do a find operation. In other words, who can query over this class. Right now, it's set so that any user can perform the action. I can untick that box and set either a role name or a user's object ID, and suddenly they will have access. That's immediately propagated through the system, and Parse will make sure to enforce all of those restrictions. All right, so that's access controls. Let's go ahead and switch back to the slides. Now that we've sort of looked at how you can protect your data, make sure that only the right people have access to it, let's talk a little bit about the things that make your app rather than just something that happens to be using Parse's backend. And that's your business logic. So we've already seen some ways that you can write your own code that defines how your app works. That was the before save, for example. But in addition to your before save, you can also write cloud functions. We just launched today background jobs, which allows you to go and do some long-running tasks. And really, any other JavaScript code that you want to write can run in our cloud code environment. So by doing all of this, you can actually make your app work however you want it to work and fill in all the gaps of the Parse framework. On the client side, we allow you to write subclasses on all of our different platforms, whether you're using C#, Objective-C, Java, or JavaScript. You can subclass Parse object and add additional functionality to Parse objects. So you can, for example, take code that looks like this. This is some C# code, where I create a new Parse object. It looks like a dictionary or a map in Java or an NS-mutable dictionary in Objective-C. We saw Kevin talk about those familiar patterns. So I can take something that looks like that, subclass Parse object, and make it look more like this, where I've actually defined my own properties and my own methods on the Parse objects that have whatever custom logic I want to have on them, and I can now just use those on the client side. All right, so let's kind of take a look back at what we talked about. We saw how you could use our prefabricated UI components to very quickly get up and running, showing data that lives on Parse. We talked about how you can, and we saw me fail at a little demo there. We talked about how you can validate your data and actually sanitize it. We talked about how you can protect access to your data using ACLs and class-level permissions. And we saw a little bit about how you can build your own business logic. So if you're ever finding yourself asking whether Parse is just for consumer apps versus line of business apps versus whatever else you might want to build, why not all of them? And with that, I'd be happy to take some questions. And I think we've got some microphones around if you have any. Yes, do we have someone who can help with the microphone? Thanks.
Any chance you guys going to add ACL support for files?
So the question was related to ACLs and Parse files. So right now, Parse files don't actually support ACLs directly. I don't know if we will actually build something like that, but what you can do in the meantime is set up a Parse object that has an ACL on it that points to the file. You won't be able to query for the files in any other way. If you need further protection from that, you can do something, depending on how you want to build it, where you have a Parse object that has a key for decrypting that file, for example. And so you need to be able to query for the object in order to decrypt the file that you've pulled down. That's sort of what we recommend in the meantime, and we'll continue thinking about that as we get feature requests. Any other questions? Yes.
Is there anything inherently bad about having lots of roles in an app?
No, nothing inherently bad about having lots of roles in the app. There are some kind of things that become more complicated to manage and some questions around how things scale, but in general, we say if you want to protect data this way, you should use a role. We've tried to make sure that that path works for you.
Thank you.
Other questions? Yes? Oh, I'm sorry, there's one over here.
No problem. How do you recommend integrating with companies' Active Directories or with single sign-on providers?
So the question was around integrating with particularly identity providers, Active Directory and single sign-on from other providers. Right now, we have a couple of built-in ones. You saw Facebook and Twitter. We also have anonymous login on iOS and Android. For other providers, there's an amount of it that's sort of up to you with how you build it with Cloud Code. So you can certainly make requests to any server that will respond to your HTTP requests from Cloud Code to go and pull down an identity. And then the question is, how do you actually get a parse user from that? And so some of the kind of workarounds at the moment are to actually produce a username and password that you can send back from a cloud function that can be used on the client to actually pull down the user again. That's one way to do it in the meantime. We're certainly thinking about ways to make that better. Sorry, just while you're there, I've got some resources for you from some of the stuff that we talked about today. Yes?
Oh, yeah. Is there basic debugging tools for the Cloud Code or like?
So the question is about debugging tools for Cloud Code. The biggest thing that we recommend to folks right now is this is really just JavaScript. It's a very similar. It's an environment very similar to Node. So there's a fair amount of debugging that you can do there. Again, it's a place where we know that there's things to improve, but we're going to continue looking at it. Yes, up here.
Is there a simple way to lock down objects to just the user who created them?
Yeah, so one of the things that you can do, and I didn't show this in iOS and Android, is setting up an ACL for the user that created an object is as simple as a switch when you're starting up the app. So the client can be set up to use a default ACL that tracks the current user. And now every object that you create on those clients will already have the ACL set up for the current user. So in general, when you're wanting to lock down an object to the user that created it, you're going to end up saying, creating an ACL where the read and write permissions are only set up for that user and nobody else will have access. Any other questions? We've got one here. I've got just a couple minutes left.
Let's say you lock down an object so that only the user can write to it, but you have a certain column that you don't want them to be able to change. Could you use before save to basically say, although you have write access to the whole object, the specific value is off limits?
Yes. So this is what I was getting at with the validation stuff before. You can always fill in the gaps of our ACLs and permissions using things like Cloud Code and particularly before save to reject a request that you know or that you have determined is a bad request. So in this case, it would be checking to see that that user falls into whatever category you're interested in, and then calling response.error and bailing out of the before save. And that will actually prevent the save from occurring. Yep.
With the before save triggers, if you're using one of the save all type functions, how does that work? Does the trigger get on all the objects, and what if one of them fails the validation? How does that all play out?
Okay, so save all on our various client SDKs batches up all of the objects or as much as it can at once, and then saves them off to the server. On the server side, you're going to get a before save for every single one of those objects, and you can determine on a per object basis which ones to save. Now, the thing that I don't know off the top of my head is if you hit an error on one of those, whether it stops immediately the processing or moves on, but that's something that if you come talk to us afterward, I can double check for you. One more question up front here. Let's get the microphone.
Is there any kind of a performance hit if I have a lot of logic in my before saves?
It really depends on what you're doing in your before save. So if your before save is making network requests, things like that, you're going to get extra latency to the time that the save actually occurs. If you're just doing an amount of code that will run pretty quickly, that will work out okay for you. We obviously have to go run the code before we can save to the database, so it's really bounded by what you've done in your before save. The most important thing to keep an eye on is whether you're hitting timeouts, because we have a limit on how long your before and after saves can run before we reject the request altogether. Alrighty, so with that, I hope you'll all stick around for the rest of the advanced track. Thank you so much for coming.